Okay, let's talk about some specific graphing features and functionality of the calculator, starting with window settings. Let's say I want to graph a quadratic and start to make sense of that quadratic and analyze its graphical features. I always start by going to this y equals button. This is the equation editor, and I'm going to dump what was in there originally. Not interested in that. The equation that I've got my heart set on is negative 2x, and here is the squared button right here on the left side. So negative 2x squared plus 12x minus 4. Making sure that I'm using all the right symbols. That's the negative sign. That's the subtraction sign. To square this x, I simply used this squared button over here. I also could have used the caret to raise my x to the second power. So I've managed to edit the equation. I'm going to press enter. And from here, most people kind of have this tendency to press graph just to see what's going on. And I'm not particularly happy with what I see. I've got this kind of dead space over to the left in quadrants 2 and 3. I cannot even see the vertex of my parabola. It appears to be up there somewhere. Of course, when I first looked at the equation, this negative leading coefficient reveals that this parabola has a max value because it's opening down. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of how do you adjust things. Well, my thinking is if you want to kind of rely on the calculator, go to the table. Let's have a look at the table. I mean, we saw from the graph that that vertex is somewhere in quadrant 2. It's going to have a positive x value and a positive y value. So when I go to the table by default starts at 0, and the values get larger for the inputs. Let's just take a moment to kind of calmly assess what we see happening here. 1 minute we're at negative 4, then the outputs start to increase, 6, 12, 14, and then suddenly they're on their way down. What is happening is that the parabola's outputs are increasing. We max out at 3, 14, which is the vertex, and then they begin this kind of steady decline. So we have this beautiful symmetry on both sides of this vertex, negative 4, negative 4, 6, 6, 12, and 12, and so on. With this in mind, and understanding that as I scroll up, these outputs are getting really, really small, really, really fast, that gives me the information that I need in my mind to create better window settings. Calculators have as their default these settings. And when you keep in mind that the screen is rectangular, the screen is what we call skewed. So it's disproportionate in a sense. We want to alter these settings. If you'll recall from the table, I don't need as much of this negative x region. These are the x minimums. Right now we're graphing from negative 10 to 10 by increments of 1 on the x-axis. On the y-axis we're going from negative 10 to 10 by increments of 1. Let's alter that. Let's say, for instance, that this is going to be negative 4 instead of negative 10. We'll keep the max at 10, and we'll keep the scale the same. But I want a lot more room in the positive direction of the y-axis, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down and change this y maximum to, let's say, 20. And rather than think about it, the distance from negative 10 to 20 is a distance of 30. Right now we're going by increments of 1. That's a lot of little marks. So why don't I change the increments from 1 to 2, for instance? And you're going to see some pretty dramatic differences graphically here. First of all, I'm making much better use of my space. The parabola is kind of filling out the screen now. Here is that vertex, very clear to see, living in quadrant number 1, and I can see all of those great characteristics that I'm looking for. This parabola lives its life in quadrants 1, not at all at 2, but in 3 and 4. So that's kind of a quick way to make sense of your window settings by kind of looking to the table to see what story the table reveals and then adjusting the window settings based on those table values. I think the other thing worth mentioning is that when you go to the table, this also has some default settings. You'll recall that when I first accessed it, I started at 0 and we're going in increments of 1. We can change that. Here, if you go to Second and Table Settings, right above the window key, we have the ability to change where the table begins. Like I might want to start at negative 10. And if the vertex is not happening at an integral value, I might not want the changes in the table values to be 1. I might want them to be something different, like a half. And so when I go to the table now, you'll see that it starts at negative 10, and my values are going by halves. There's a negative 10, and then here's an output. but the next input is negative 9.5, and then negative 9, and so on. So that was a quick tutorial on how to adjust your window settings to better accommodate a graph depending on the kind of graph that it is. And that's a big part of what we'll be doing this year, really thinking deeply about what data tells us and what patterns it reveals.